But all of us have these blinkers on. And so the trick is to get rid of those, get closer to the action, especially closer to the people for whom you're solving for. And really also find ways to get them to be part of that solution as well.
Today we have with us Mr. Gaurav Gupta from Dalberg, India. He's Partner in Asia Director at Dalberg Advisors and founded Dalberg's first Asia office in Mumbai. Under his leadership, the firm has rapidly expanded to Delhi and Singapore, with presence in other cities in Southeast Asia and Australia. He works with global development institutions, governments, corporations, and civil society on their efforts towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. He globally heads Dalberg's impact measurement and climate and energy practice. Outside of Dalberg, Mr. Gaurav sits on the board of Educate Girls, one of India's largest NGOs focused on girl education and empowerment. He holds a BA in Philosophy, Politics and Economics from Oxford and an MA in International and Development Economics from Yale University. It is a pleasure to have you here, sir.
Thanks for that intro. It's very comprehensive. I appreciate it.
Before we begin, it would be great if you could share with us your background and how you have built such a close relationship with CSR initiatives through your career and now specifically at Dalberg.
Well, I think I started my career I've always been in the private sector. I started my career with the Boston Consulting Group, working largely with corporates and helping business think about how it can do whatever it does better. My personal interests have been much more in the social space, and I have been from university days and so forth. So I think what's interesting, obviously, about CSR is it brings an opportunity for not just sort of grant capital, but it brings the corporate side into a discussion on what can it do to impact on various social causes. So for me, I guess as a background, it's merging to some extent, being someone who traditionally has been working on business issues, is very interested in, and over the last, I guess, 10, 12 years has been completely focused only on social issues and bringing those two worlds together. Because for me, the CSR side is not just the capital that is brought, for example, in India because of the 2% rule, but in general because corporates do spend on these kind of things, but also the acumen that corporates have, right? Those capabilities. So the nature of capital is also different. And that has its advantages, but it also has its pitfalls. So I think it's very interesting that how to think about CSR not as just a pool of capital, but how to think about it as how to make that pool of capital powerful. And to make it powerful, you have to go beyond just the amount that's in there. How do you bring everything else that the corporate can bring as part of the equation?
That is actually a very interesting thought about how to make it more than just capital, how to make that capital powerful. And, as you said, in India and also around the world, CSR is a growing sector. So it does offer multiple opportunities and it also brings with it certain challenges. So as someone who has spent so many years in this sector now, what do you think are a few things firms should not compromise on getting right when it comes to, CSR?
That's a great question. I think maybe I'll start with what I think is sometimes the wrong question that gets asked. The question is always like, what is the most impactful opportunity out there? Well, what is this thing in healthcare make more impact than this thing in education? Or there's more visibility over here, so should I do that? And actually, that's not the first question. The first question is, what can I do well? Because the biggest missing resource in the issues that CSR and philanthropy and everybody else that's working on social issues, government is missing, is actually not money. It's a solution that works. Like, it's not always about money. It's like what's missing is hard skills, experience, long-term application, excellence. I would put that whole thing under the term excellence. That's what's missing. So we don't need companies and others, many of suddenly thinking about something new. right? Oh, I should get into education. The question is not like, oh, which of these things is most impactful? The question is, what is it that I can deliver excellence in? And within that space, what's the right thing to do? Because the biggest missing ingredient is excellence. So if you're a corporate that maybe because of where you're based or the skill sets that you have internally, some of the knowledge that's sitting there, or just the motivation of the team and the experience of the team that's working on CSR is driving you towards, hey, I can do a better job in this particular space, then that's the space you should work on. Doing some sort of gap analysis is largely pointless because everything's a gap. And especially if you're working in low and middle income countries and emerging economies like India, I mean, there's no gap that any corporate can ever fill. It can just like put in a little bit of sand into it. It's never going to fill it. So let's not talk about where are the gaps. Let's just talk about what are you good at and that you can with confidence deliver excellently. And from there, let's build out. So that's the thing not to compromise on, right? Always be pushing on excellence. And, I understand that, part of what CSR needs to deliver for companies is brand, right? Even recognition amongst employees and future employees. Like, these are all important things. The best way of getting there is actually to start delivering something that is so great and deep, right? That everything speaks for itself. If you look in the social space, the good news stories are very few. And so the ones that are there, they reverberate for a very long time. People constantly are talking about, everyone has their stories of the social entrepreneurship thing that worked, and they constantly retell it, and it's always that one story and so forth. So if you can crack that, that's going to give you a huge amount of returns. And cracking that requires a very strong focus just on excellence rather than, picking some high ROI type approach to this space. That's at least been our observation. That doesn't mean that there isn't a role at some point in that journey to say, okay, is this better or is this better? What is a bigger issue for the person that I'm trying to solve something for? I think those are important questions, but that's not the starting question.
And of course, there is no, one size fits all. It's about what the company is. And like you said, not just filling the gaps, but finding what you can excel at and what you can bring to the table, basically, essentially. One of the interesting things about Dalberg, coming to Dalberg, is also that you have an impact-first approach. And I found that interesting because what does that mean first? What does Dalberg's impact-first approach mean? And how does that translate into CSR advisory or strategy thinking?
Impact first, you could argue, is a philosophical sort of notion, right? So I almost think that's the only position we can have. I find it odd so let's talk about impact investing. Right? That's a very sexy thing at the moment. And I think I find it odd that someone can say, okay, well, you see this pool of capital here, that's my impact investing pool. And I define that as this pool of capital. Often, I want market returns, but it's also creating some good social outcomes. See, once someone says that, the question is, what the hell are you doing with the other money? I mean, if that's how you describe this money, how are you describing the other 99% of your portfolio? So you're doing bad things with that portfolio? Like, what are you doing? And it's similar, I think, to advisory. I mean, we're an advisory firm, fundamentally. A bunch of different services, clients. And I don't know how else to describe it. Like, unless we have a belief that the projects that we're taking on fundamentally improving the lives of people on the planet, we can't have that being like, we don't have a social arm, right? Because what that's saying to everybody else is, well, the other guys are not improving the lives of people. So these things need to be mainstream concepts. So yes, our biggest lens is that when we work with clients, we take on problem statements where we are convinced that this will improve the lives of people on this planet, and will improve the planet, right? I mean, that sounds all very high, high level and fluffy, but it's not just a statement. I mean, it is how we're legally structured. So we've put our brand actually in an NGO. We're a private company, but our brand sits in an NGO. And the NGO is unconcerned with our profits as such. They're simply there to make sure that the work that we do is indeed filling out that mission. And that's how we're able to keep a track of this. So we describe ourselves as profit making, but not profit maximizing. Obviously, we work for a lot of companies, not necessarily in their CSR, but in work and in problem statements that we and the clients, we're all delighted to work on, because we think this, if you're a spectacle maker, how do you make sure that the 2 billion people that don't have correct vision today, how can you sustainably serve them? Because you're not serving them today. And there's so many people who have uncorrected vision. We'll work on that problem statement. We'll not work on a problem statement which says, well, this guy's got 1 billion, make him the next billion. Not interesting. So that's how we describe ourselves. And then obviously CSR by its very nature is generally, I would say 100%, I would like to say 100% of the time, I would say 90% of the time, very much the type of projects that are pushing for general improvements of people and planet.
It is also interesting that you mentioned that it is a philosophical concept, and then you're sort of turning it into how can you practically use it in the world that we are in today. And also Dalberg is a global firm which is focusing on local needs. What do you think are some certain challenges that global firms face in planning initiatives that center around local issues, and how might these challenges be tackled?
So I think it's less about global firms and local issues. It's actually about, I think it's more a form of elitism than anything else. So I could be for example, in India, we're an Indian firm, registered in India, everything, right? It's more about, and anyone, you can be an Infosys, you can be a Tata's, you can be any of those. The question is, are you able to solve the issues where they're being experienced versus that whole thing of, top-down, boardroom. That's actually the heart of the challenge. It's less about whether someone's a global firm or not. Globalism is a good thing, right? What it allows us to do is to be like, call up our team in Kenya and be like, hey, I heard you experienced this issue. What did you do? And it's lovely to be able to exchange things and to discover delight in recognizing that we often have the same challenges, and that a solution that was born here can actually be applied elsewhere, or at least help, right? But what that doesn't make up for is that the people who you're, 90% of the time, it's people you're solving for. Sometimes, you're trying to solve for a tree, right? You want more trees, so your client is a tree. But majority of the times, it's people that you're solving for. And they also have a much better idea than you on how to solve. And so, the thing to figure out is how to get to a place where you're working with them, recognizing that they're actually the experts on majority of the things that you're talking about. And then you're there to help facilitate structure and get their voice to people who are going to make some decisions. And that requires you to be on the ground and to act with humility in those things, which is also a little bit of the way in which we personally hire as well, our folks. I think that's the challenge, and that doesn't matter if I see that being done good and bad by firms, and it has nothing to do with whether they're international or local. And I have hired people in India from local firms, and then we've gone out in the field, and I've had people say to me, it's the first time I've been in a village. And to me, it's like just crazy, right? I'm like, what have you been doing for the last 25 years? But all of us have these blinkers on. And so the trick is to get rid of those, get closer to the action, especially closer to the people for whom you're solving for. And really also find ways to get them to be part of that solution as well.
You also mentioned about making CSR more than just capital, but capital is, as we all know, an important aspect of CSR. And some firms, some smaller firms might not have or might have limited CSR spend. And in such a scenario, what are some of the key things that you think these firms need to keep in mind in order to ensure maximum impact on a limited budget?
If you look at most of what works, and then also what doesn't work. It's not about the level of money, it's design. When people talk about microfinance as being transformative, it's not that. It was an idea, and it was an idea that started very small, but it was a beautiful design. Someone, Muhammad Yunus looked at people's behaviors and said, we have to design differently. Right? It wasn't about how much money was poured in. And then once your design is right, money will come from different places, or whether it's money or resources. I mean, if you design things correctly, you may not need any money. Some of the biggest organizations on the planet in the social space are volunteer-led. Now, if someone was to actually add up what that was worth, it would be enormous. Your Scouts, Lions, all these clubs, for example. Educate Girls, you mentioned Educate Girls, an organization I've been involved with. I mean, it has a workforce, as part of its workforce is a volunteer-led workforce. And it's huge. So design is the most important thing. And I don't think what you have to figure out, whether you have, 1 CR to spend or 10 CR to spend, is find a problem you feel you could attack, that you have some sense of, I can do better than others. Like I have a comparative advantage. It might be because of the passion of the CSR team. It might be because of the company, whatever. But then really focus on developing a great design. Right? And you can do that with 1 CR. If your problem is well defined enough, you can do that with 10 CR, and you can totally squander 100 CR. Right? So, in fact, I sometimes find that because when people have limited cash, they almost are willing to take more risk and also to try and punch above their weight. They're often being more innovative around design.
Coming to our present situation right now, we cannot ignore the fact that there is a pandemic going on in the world for the past 2 years. And it has brought into focus the socio-economic divide and also the need for better, health infrastructure specifically. In a post-pandemic world, in a world where pandemic exists, what role can the CSR sector play, and how can we put resources to optimal use in CSR?
See, I think the pandemic itself is a good example of what I was describing around how every type of capital has a particular nature to it, right? Philanthropic capital is not answerable to anybody. It has a very interesting, can be long-term, can be risk-taking. CSR capital is very interesting. It brings the might of a company, but it's highly governed, right? And these are generally either public companies or there's a lot of transparency. It's interesting. It has its own nature, and often it can be applied where companies are in fact already operating. So it also comes with a lot of on-ground knowledge presence and so forth. Government capital has its own thing. So firstly, I think the nature of capital is very important here. And so when a pandemic hits, what do you need to do? Well, you need to pivot. Unfortunately, even though this was a pandemic that could be seen was about to come, it's not really a black swan event. We weren't still prepared, but we needed to all pivot, move fast, and so forth. Now, I would imagine, unlike governments, what CSR capital can do is pivot, is be fast, is take some risks in times like this. Whether it did it or not, I don't know. But that's a reckoning we have to think about and learning from all of this and be like, here we have effectively private capital. It's in the control of a company. It's not a bureaucracy, or it shouldn't be a bureaucracy. We have an immediate need on the front lines where NGOs are, people who are putting their lives at risk. Did we operate in a way in which we continue to be like asking her to do lots of paperwork, check-in, reporting and stuff? Or did we say, you guys know what you need to do because you're close to the ground. Everybody needs to pivot. We're going to give you flexible money, or we're going to trust you. Like those are the things in the pandemic that can be done, but also suddenly a whole set of new opportunities that could be leveraging what a company does, right? We had to build whole new logistics chains, whole new cold chains. There are companies that can suddenly start to see themselves inside that. And how do they use, in some ways, their CSR as just an avenue through which they can apply their skills in a time of crisis. In a time of crisis, we all go in and start working. We're all volunteers, right? And so that's also another fantastic thing that a company can bring during these times. So that's like in the pandemic, during the pandemic, thinking a bit about what is the thing that they want to focus on. And that may not have anything to do with the pandemic, and that may be okay. There's a lot of stuff that's getting neglected at the moment as well. But I think that it's more about what are the lessons you're taking away. Can I be flexible? Can I be more trusting with my partners, right? And how am I also able to pivot and have some contingency, right? I think these are the things that are really what's the most important thing from a post-pandemic perspective.
I think also the questions that you mentioned, that the companies can or should start asking themselves have also existed, and now they've sort of being brought back into the focus with the pandemic. So these are questions that we keep on going and solving as and when they come. So that is very interesting. Measuring what I would put into quotes true social impact is sometimes even seen as something that is very expensive as a thing to do. So what are then the ways that in which funding can be used to sort of measure social impact of these CSI initiatives?
Measuring is not expensive, because what is expense? Expense is about how much are you putting in relative to the return on investment. So no one says it's if I'm funding, let's say, teachers to teach kids something in a school, no one says teachers are expensive. They say, measuring whether students learned anything is expensive. It just seems so strange. And the reason for it is fairly simple, right? I mean, if you're going to spend 10 CR in saying to teachers, hey, let's try this sort of, after school curriculum that's going to help increase learning outcomes for kids. And let's say you have the option to deliver that after school for half an hour. Or let's say you have the option to deliver it at before school for half an hour. Just that design choice can actually change completely whether how many kids turn up, whether people are listening or not listening at school, and the ultimate outcome that you're paying for, which isn't to pay teachers' salaries, but learning outcomes for kids could double or triple. So if you've spent 10% of your budget on monitoring, measuring, and understanding if what you're hoping to achieve is happening, and to even be able to see, is one experiment better than another, the return on investment on that is 10x in reality. And that's what I was saying earlier, which is design is really everything. Once people have been like, I've got the design, then money can actually come in. Doesn't have to be your money. So in fact, especially if CSR is looking to create a splash and be able to say, look, I did something really innovative and so forth, you're almost better off investing in monitoring and evaluation, because what it can do is set them up as a case study. It can help them be like, this didn't work. Okay, I made these improvements. This worked. Now I can share that with the world. And in fact, the world comes into fund as opposed to just me funding. That's going to take you much further, right? And so I think of course, within itself, there are cheaper and more expensive ways of doing measurement. And the trick to it is to actually invest up front. Because if you invest up front in your projects to make sure that your whole monitoring evaluation is really thought through, and that stuff can be a bit expensive, it will save you money down the line. Because it actually makes it easier to do follow-ups because you've got the systems in place. You're not paying somebody to come in and retrospectively collect data, which is a very expensive thing to do. But most importantly, you're driving your money way further because everything is about the design here. As opposed to this archaic notion that, I had 10 CR and 10 CR went all into project delivery. That doesn't mean you created even 10 CR of actual value. And that is why, in fact, people who spend 1 CR but have better design can be delivering way more value than you, because we often miss out that it's about getting the design right, and that requires measurement and evaluation. These are intractable problems, right? Everything we're dealing with in the social space are intractable problems. You have to respect that. People are not stupid. These things have remained problems, not because of a consistency of stupidity, is because they're hard to solve. And you're not going to get by simply coming in and suddenly you've discovered education and putting girls back into school, and so now you've thrown some money at the problem. You are going to have to invest in proper research and learning because they're complex. And that's really what monitoring evaluation does for you.
Thank you so much, Gaurav, for being here and sharing those insights with us. We are now at the end of our interview. And on behalf of CSR Box, I just want to thank you for being here and spending your valuable time with us.
It's a pleasure. Great questions. Thanks for making this easy.